And welcome to this edition of Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray. How are you?
I'm very good, Keith. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Um, Folks will know our guest today, Jim Campbell. Ray, why don't you introduce Jim for us?
I'll be glad to. Jim's a good friend. He and I go back a ways. We've been on several boards together. I make a habit of getting on the nominating committee for the boards that I get on for nonprofits. And generally, I bring Jim and people like Bear Stevenson, those kind of folks. I bring them on these boards. And then I move on and leave them with it. So we've got Jim here today. The thing that Jim's doing now, of course, he's the president of the East Tennessee Economic Council and has been for a number of years. Very important position for our community and keeping the political influences that we need to keep funding coming into the city. He's always attuned to that. But the thing that I'm proudest of right now is that he's also the chairman of the board for the American Museum of Science and Energy Foundation. And we'll get to that a little bit as we're talking to him, but that's an important position too, because we're working there to take over the operation of the museum, both the K-25 History Center and the American Museum of Science and Energy. And we're getting close to getting that done. Jim's really worked hard to get that done, and I'm proud of that. But Jim, if that's all right, we'll start with letting you tell us a little bit about where you're coming from as far as Oak Ridge. And I think you said you wanted to talk about the birth of the city a little bit. So let's start with that, if you will.
Yeah, so I came to Oak Ridge in 1982 to work for the Oak Ridger and begin telling the stories of Oak Ridge through print media a good while ago. After just graduating with a master's degree in history from the University of Oregon. So the history of this place has always been a fascinating subject for me. And the way the history impacts what happens to this day is very important. And we'll talk about a couple of the players in that game. What Ray didn't mention was I'm also a fellow at the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee. And in that capacity, I got access to the archives over there for Congressman Howard Baker Sr.'s papers and some other things. And Congressman was very instrumental in the creation of what is now the city of Oak Ridge. And in fact, the story of the birth of Oak Ridge has really not been told very well yet, I don't believe. And perhaps maybe someday somebody will get around to writing a book about all the different things that happened.
Well, you know, our theme here is hidden history. So I think that's right on target for you to bring out that aspect that has not been told. But let me take you on just a little tangent and then we'll come back to that. You working with the Oak Ridger, obviously you knew Dick Smizer.
I did. I worked for him. I worked for a number of years, yes.
And one other thought, you and I were a part of a group that had to go up or got to go up and interview Senator Howard Baker, Congressman Baker's son. And that was one of the first oral histories that we did a number of years ago. We set up in his office, if you'll remember, with a huge television camera. We just use an iPhone or something today. Keith's equipment's much smaller than what we had back then. Yeah. But we did that, set up, and then started off by you asking him, tell us about your connection to Oak Ridge. Mm-hmm. And the first thing he did is, you remember, and I'll cut this a little short, was to tell that Senator McKellar story. Mm-hmm. And then when we finished, we thanked him for putting it on video, and he said, where did you get that story? And Dick Smizer is the source for me and was for him of those Senator McKellar stories.
No, the other story he told in that conversation was his first legal case when he was just out of law school, and he was representing a used car salesman in Oak Ridge on the corner of Illinois Avenue and the Turnpike there, which is a vacant lot now. There used to be a used car lot there, and he lost that case, and he remembered that case in great detail because he lost his first case. Howard was he was a great interview and a great person to know and to work with. Yeah.
And we might want to add, you're absolutely right, Ray, and I'll bring this up. I think I've mentioned it before. That was the very first oral history that we did for the Center for Oak Ridge Oral History. And I remember it specifically because I was scheduled to go to Huntsville with you guys to do that, the very first one, but my father passed away. And that weekend, so I had the funeral and the family, and our friend Matt Mullins, who's now at AMSI, Matt was the one who I asked to go and shoot that interview for us. So that whole interview is available on our website, on the Cora website, the transcript, and I think also the video. So if people are interested in seeing that, they can find it by going to the Center for Oak Ridge Oral History.
It was a good day.
So,
even though we got us lost on the drive up to Huntsville, but we'll not talk about it.
He did get lost. I might add, Keith, that we have how many now? Is it 800 oral histories?
It's 800 or 900 oral histories. One of the largest oral history collections in the country, and by far the largest DOE site collection. So,
Been good work by you and the library people and a whole bunch of others that have contributed to that. No question about it.
We actually caught that in the optimum years, because near the end, Keith, as you know, we no longer have Manhattan Project era veterans that we can talk to. They've all gone except for just a very small handful, and we got it at a good time. Yeah. Okay, Jim, let's go back to the birth of the city and tell us a little about, from your standpoint, about Oak Ridge.
So World War II happened, and you've got this $1 billion investment in 1940s dollars in Oak Ridge that had just taken place. You've got some fairly unique facilities like the graphite reactor, like the Collutrons at Y12, the K25 facility out there. And about 30,000 people of the 80,000 or so that came here during the Manhattan Project stayed on to continue the work at those plants, but they really didn't know what their future missions were going to be. And they were living in housing that had been assigned to them by the federal government. The Roane Anderson Corporation was running the town as a kind of military base operation. And then a group got together, and in 1948, they held a citywide referendum to say, let's create a city. And it took 10 years from 1940, or 12 years, from 1948 to really 1960, 61, 62 time period before the city was actually incorporated. And the decisions that had to be made about what this city would look like, what its charter said, how many people would represent it on council, who would own the land, how do you deal with the land issue, which is still problematic in some ways. The hospital was owned by the government. Was it going to be a wet or dry county? And there was a war between the liquor store owners and the church pastors for the whole decade of the 1950s over whether you could sell liquor in Oak Ridge or not. There became a really good smuggling industry for people who would, your buddies at Y12, who were really good at making cases, learned how to smuggle liquor past the guards to get into town during the 1950s. It was,
I need to insert just a small comment. On one occasion, Jack Case was coming out of the airport in Knoxville, and he had liquor in a suitcase, and one of the bottles broke. It spilled out on the floor in the airport, made one of the people there working at the airport so mad he called the police and reported him, and they stopped Jack going down through Alcoa with that liquor in his car.
You know, there's some great stories there. The battle over the hospital was between the Presbyterians, the Catholics, and the Methodists. And at the end of the day, obviously, the Methodists won. It's still Methodist Medical Center. But unique things happened during that whole era. And one of the more interesting characters in all this was Guilford Glacier. And we've forgotten about Guilford in Oak Ridge, and we shouldn't. Guilford was in the Army. His dad was a steel mill operator over in Knoxville. Got out of the Army, and he was selling steel, but he didn't much care for that business. So he built in Oak Ridge the first shopping center. Beginning in 1954, he began acquiring land. His first tenant, Ray, was the U.S. Postal Service. And
really?
He worked really hard with people like Gene Joyce and Congressman Baker to get a post office for Oak Ridge. And it's still in the same place it was then. They actually want to move it now, but the effort to get that post office in downtown Oak Ridge, which was a place where people gathered, came to get their passports, all those kinds of things, which Oak Ridge didn't have until really about 1957. I think it was 57 or 58 when that came. And as Ray knows, the new AMSI building is in one of Glacier's original buildings. And has more steel in it, more of his daddy's steel, than any other building I've ever seen. I believe it was probably the original bomb shelter for Oak Ridge, but I'm not sure about that.
I can't prove that either. I do know that it was so difficult to tear down that they decided to leave it rather than tear it down, is why we still have it available to us.
And if you ever get to wander around in the basement of that building, you'll see a lot of beams stamped Glacier steel on them. And Sears obviously was the first tenant in there, the Sears catalog store, and a great story. Guilford went on from Oak Ridge to become the biggest shopping center builder in the United States. Go ahead, Ray.
Let me keep that thought. I want to add that one other of his tenants was the Davis brothers with their cafeteria. And I've told this story on here before, so I'm going to really cut it short. But it's because of Guilford Glacier, and actually Guilford Glacier's son, who was on an airplane with the mayor and one of the preachers that you talked about. In 1955, when they were, well, actually in the 1960s, when they were trying to integrate the rest of Oak Ridge. The schools integrated in 1955, Robert Field and the high school, but they didn't get things like the barbershops, and they didn't get the restaurants until in the 60s. And one of the reasons is because Guilford Glacier learned of it, and the Davis brothers didn't want to integrate. But he took them and told them that if they would integrate their restaurant, he would give them their following 6 or 8 years, whatever it was, of rent on the bowling lanes that they also was renting from him. So he gave them some $48,000 in relief of rent if they'd integrate their restaurant. Now, not only did they integrate their restaurant, but one of those brothers was on a restaurant association for our restaurants in the South, and they integrated all of their restaurants. So they led the way in integration of restaurants in the South. Guilford Glacier is one, you're right, an unsung hero that we in Oak Ridge should give much more attention to. And you were talking about the other places he built.
Yeah, well, he built all around the nation, mostly in the Midwest, but also in California. He retired as the, I think, fourth wealthiest man in the world on the Forbes list. He needs to be recognized in some way for his role. Even though he never lived in Oak Ridge, he continued to be a major influencer in Oak Ridge through the 1990s and really into the 20th century. The renovation of the mall property that we're talking about now, he still owns, his family and his family's foundation still owns 3 of those properties on the Oak Ridge Turnpike. So
sounds like a good historical marker very near the downtown area would be in order. Huh.
I think you should name the street after him personally, but
I think so too. I tried to get them to consider Wilson Street.
Yeah, that would be a good one. Yeah, to name it. So the other thing going on during the period from 48 to 60 is the town fathers, whoever they could be defined as, were trying to figure out how to build an economy. Obviously, if you have one employer, the U.S. government, that employs almost everybody in town, you've got fences all around the place, it's real difficult to bring in new kinds of industry and different kinds of things. And there were people at the lab and at Y12 who wanted to leave and start their own businesses. And in the late 50s and early 60s, a war started between Alvin Weinberg and Dick Smyser, who were best of friends. Dick was the young newspaper editor, and Alvin was the young new director of Oak Ridge National Lab. And a few of his scientists, probably 6 or 7, went out and started what's now known as ORTAC up on Illinois Avenue as you're coming into town. Now EG&G ORTAC. And ORTAC was taking sensor technology for different uses and building a startup business. And in response to that, Alvin put in some rules at the lab that no one could leave and start their own business in Oak Ridge. And Dick got incited, and the war got public in the newspaper, and they would go back and forth at each other for a good long while. And it really deterred, I think, some of the opportunities for economic growth in early Oak Ridge. And it's a problem to this day. I mean, I had this talk with Tom Mason when he was lab director. We had a young scientist who was working on a solar project that we wanted to spin out and create a business here in Oak Ridge around. And he was also one of the best young scientists at ORNL, and Tom didn't want him to leave. And so we got into it a little bit. Tom, in the end, we both lost. He sold his company to a group in California, and now is working at, I think, NREL National Lab out in Colorado. So,
but Jim, let me ask you a question. In the 70s, though, technology transfer, the lab and the government sort of embraced technology transfer, didn't they? And which is basically, licensing things that are developed at the lab to private industry to market.
I will say there are much better tools for developing private-public partnerships available to the Department of Energy now than there were in 1958.
Right.
Um, one of the other topics I've spent a lot of time on is nuclear medicine. And it's right in the middle of this fray, because what we found actually during the Manhattan Project, a scientist named Waldo Cohn discovered that the graphite reactor could produce 66 or so isotopes that might have medicinal uses in the treatment of cancers. And the first tech transfer that happened at the lab was Waldo in September of 1945 wrote an essay in Nature magazine saying, I can make these. If anybody needs them, call me up, literally. And a few years later, the Atomic Energy Agency brought in Abbott Laboratories to mass produce certain isotopes and get them to research organizations, hospitals, and clinics all around the nation, mainly in St. Louis, but also some up in New York and Boston, California. And that was really the sales of those isotopes generated the first real industry, private sector industry in Oak Ridge. Abbott left Oak Ridge when the graphite reactor was turned off in 1964. And right now we're trying to kickstart that industry with, I actually talked to a company in Michigan this week about what they're doing in the isotope development world. Why aren't they in Oak Ridge doing that? We'll see what comes of that. The other part of this is when you invent a new product, you have to develop a workforce around that. You have to train people on how to use it, how to safely, what it's good for, what the dosages are. There's a whole lot of research and development and training that has to go into that. And the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, now ORAL, at that point hired a gentleman named Marshall Brewster, who was a captain in the Air Force, I believe, Army or Air Force. Air Force, and he came in and started the medical division at Oak Ridge Associated Universities. And I'm sure, Ray, you've done a story or one of these blogs with the historian there at Oral, talking about the different things they did in the 1950s and 60s to promote the use of nuclear medicines. Because it's a tremendous story. It's a story that I think eclipses what Oak Ridge did with the nuclear Navy, which has gotten a whole lot more press because it's a lot more visible subject. But Marshall was brilliant and one of the greatest writers. If you read his materials, they're hysterical. They're easy to read on a subject that's really hard to deal with. But he made it fun for people to get involved in it and was a real champion of nuclear medicine. He got sick in the 60s, moved out to Arizona, continued to write histories of nuclear medicine all his life, died in the early 90s and did some things there. So you've got the production of isotopes, you've got the training, then you start looking at other kinds of things in the field of medicine. Polio was one, and vaccinations, which is a hot topic today, why we're on Zoom instead of sitting around a coffee table together. But in the 1960s, I'm blanking on names right now, but the Oak Ridge National Lab was asked to see if they could separate the cancer out of cells in human body tissues, and got a fairly significant NIH grant to do that. Well, it turned out they couldn't do that, but they invented a small centrifuge that could spin at 1,000 revolutions per minute, that could separate the good stuff from the bad stuff in the polio vaccine that Dr. Fawkes was making at the time, and it worked. And the Atomic Energy Agency licensed that technology to Eli Lilly Company, which still has that technology and still uses that technology in production of isotopes. And that's the bad stuff was what made people have reactions to shots, and why people weren't getting vaccinated at the time. They were afraid that they would react badly. And Oak Ridge was right in the center of the development of a machine that would improve the way we take vaccinations right now and increase people's trust in using those vaccines.
You know, and kind of a side story to that, kind of a side note, and how you tie Oak Ridge into that was, you know, the Rotary organization was very influential in worldwide polio vaccinations. And one of our own, Bill Sargent, he's got a statue of him in Knoxville in Crutch Park, because he really led the effort for worldwide polio vaccinations. And so it's interesting that both of those things kind of happened in Oak Ridge.
And to bring it forward, the Gates Foundation has partnered with Oak Ridge National Laboratory and their supercomputers to actually map using GPS coordinates where each polio case in the world is today. And they can track visually where they are. Most of them are in Africa. There's some up in the Afghan, Pakistan hill country. There's not very many, at least the last time I looked at that map, there were like 40 or so cases. But it continues, Keith.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Two quick thoughts. One, I've published Historically Speaking for about 15, 16 years now. And last year I got it syndicated. It's now being run in the Morgan County Today. And all I'm doing there is just taking old Historical Speaking columns and sending them over to them. So it's very easy. But one of the series that I'm running right now is the series that I wrote about Bill Sargent. He was a neat guy in a number of ways, and internationally led the polio effort for Rotary. And the second point is Alvin Weinberg was asked what's the most important contribution Oak Ridge has made to the world. And without any hesitation, he said nuclear medicine helps millions of people every year. So Jim, you're right on target, and Keith, we all understand the importance of nuclear medicine and Oak Ridge's contribution to something that has worldwide impact.
And I haven't even talked about Ron Nutt and his little effort on PET scans, CAT scans, which he sold about 15 years ago for his little company for hundreds of millions of dollars. So, and Ron's another one of those characters that deserves to be written about, because developing that machine, he actually took technology that he had worked with at the lab, married it with large animal medicine at the UT Ag campus, and created something that everybody in the world uses to this day.
Yeah.
So Siemens now owns it and employs probably around 600-700 people in East Tennessee because of that machine.
And I heard something just a couple of weeks ago on NPR about you know the medical technology, the medical science continues. They came up with some kind of COVID. I don't know exactly what it is, but it has to do with determining something to do with COVID and the vaccine that's going on right now.
And of course, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory is right in the middle of the research on COVID. They
exactly.
Talked heavily in that right today.
A lot of interesting things that happen from a policy point of view, from a business point of view, from a cultural point of view, from the first symphony orchestra in the state of Tennessee was in Oak Ridge. The advancement of women in science was a very strong component here. People like Leanne Russell, all those folks that kind of set the standards for health physics. For we've talked, Ray, about the gentleman who just died, Mr. Arbach, and his trip to Japan right after World War II ended, and some of the things that he saw and led him to do later in his career. Fascinating. That period of time when all these really smart people working together were trying to do new, difficult, hard things. It's a really interesting period of maturation for the city of Oak Ridge and for really the future missions that we're still working on to this day. So,
yep.
Interesting time.
Yeah, very interesting time. One other side thought, just between the two of us to remember, as you know, Lee Rittinger is leading a team to write a book about the UT and Oak Ridge connection. And we need to be sure that stories you're talking about of that tech transfer that had the involvement of the university and Oak Ridge, we need to be sure they get in there. There's so much to write about that I fear that some things that really should be included may not get there if we don't help all we can. So,
well, you think about the importance of the UT Arboretum to the city, and the Atomic Energy Agency was able to transfer that land to the university because partnering with universities was a good thing for them. They couldn't transfer it to the city of Oak Ridge under the law of the day. And the city of Oak Ridge needed an industrial park. So as part of the Arboretum property was Union Valley Road. Union Valley Road was given to the city by the University of Tennessee as its first industrial park. And it's kind of a convoluted way to get an industrial park, but that was the only way the city could get it in that part of time.
Wow.
Interesting days, interesting stories.
Yep.
Yeah, sure was, and continues. I mean, even today, there's things taking place out at the East Tennessee Technology Park that are setting the stage for future opportunities for people to create new industry and to bring industry in. In fact, I believe you're working with some that are coming in that have to do with nuclear medicine.
Koki Pharma has acquired 200 acres of property out there to make molybdenum-99. They are in the development stages of that project. Hopefully, in the next 5-6 years, they'll be doing that there and distributing at the new airport that hopefully we'll get. So, and we're working with a couple other companies that are in similar, looking at similar opportunities. So we'll see.
All right.
Wow. Some great history there, Jim. Really was.
Yeah.
Well, it's a fun place to tell stories about. And Alan Lowe and I at AMSI and have been talking about his expertise, which is in presidential history. He's an archivist and a person who's served as director of several presidential libraries. And if you look at the public policy of science, it goes back to Abraham Lincoln, who started the National Academy of Sciences. And it kind of moves forward from there. I spent some time in the Roosevelt Library a couple of years ago looking at who was advising the president on the science of the atom bomb project, of the Manhattan Project. And it goes back before Einstein's letter, and it goes back to discussions about medicine, about transportation, because the military, the U.S. had acquired properties around the globe, Guam, the Philippines, and other places, and they needed to get their supplies into these places. And coal ships and steam travel was expensive because you had to carry so much fuel. Could you develop a better kind of engine? And people were looking at the atom as an energy source for the Navy even before World War II started. So they were looking for, that source. So interesting discussions that were going on.
Yeah.
Let's talk just a minute before we wind up here about the American Museum of Science and Energy and about the AMSI Foundation and what's actually taking place now and what's planned for the near future. Let's say a few words about that, Jim.
So the museum has been, I think, one of the underutilized Oak Ridge assets in many ways. It tells a great story about what's happening behind the fences that people can't see. It tells a little bit of the evolution of that science and the environmental cleanup work and the weapons work that happened here. In the future, though, we want to take that story out, not just have it a local asset here. We're working real hard right now to put a lot of the resources online, both educational and informational. Put some of the tours online that because of COVID, we've had to shut down for the past couple of months. So how do we make that a more integral part of telling the story, not just in Oak Ridge, but in the region, in the United States? It is an American museum, and the foundation wants to make it so. We're going to recruit in the next few years a national advisory board so that we can tell the story better. The lab and Y12 and our friends in the environmental management world are all cooperating with us and looking to run it as a true nonprofit that wants to build the asset for the community and keep it growing.
I think it's well to note that AMSI is a heritage tourism draw, and the fact that we were able to put things online will not detract from it being a draw in the future. Along with, there's a total of 5 museums, that we have in Oak Ridge. The Children's Museum, where the Manhattan Project National Historical Park has their visitor center. And then we have the Y12 History Center. Again, because of COVID, access is restricted there. The K-25 History Center, which just opened the last week in February and then had to close in the middle of March. But it's a great asset. Additionally, there's going to be the replica building of the K-25 gaseous diffusion process that we'll see in the next year or two, see that construction. And then there's an interpretive center that's going out there. So that area is going to grow. And oh, by the way, some of that's already online in the form of the K-25 History Museum, the online version. And then there's the Oak Ridge Museum, Oak Ridge History Museum, that the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association folks have put together a really good job that tells that part of the story that actually did not get transferred to the new location of AMSI, the story of the people, the story of the city. AMSI does a good job, as you mentioned, of talking about the science and talking about the origin of Oak Ridge. But there was an element of it that in the old museum was the Oak Ridge room that we just didn't have room for, a place for in the new location. But that has evolved into a whole new separate museum that, again, is really well done. And they've taken the time during this COVID crisis, they've taken the time to utilize some $80,000 in grants from the state to put in really good lighting, put in showcases for their exhibits, and have done a lot of renovation to that Midtown Community Center location. So all of that, and I think AMSI can lead the way in showing how that we can take these museums that we have and make them available online to attract even more visitors to come to Oak Ridge. So I'm really glad for the direction that I see the AMSI and the foundation moving.
If you look at just the historic number of visitors, vis-a-vis how many people go to the national park, for example, or how many people drive down I-75 or across I-40, there's a huge opportunity to bring more people to hear the Oak Ridge story. And
you got to realize over, what, 10 million people go to the Smokies? If we could just get 1% of that to get out, and if when we put those signs up, and we're going to put the signs up on the interstate that advertises the national park, they will come. We will have more people. We know what to do with it.
And that's, means you got to sell them some hamburgers, and you got to
that's it. And
sell them some gas.
It's true.
And a place to sleep overnight. You bet.
So, the museum right now is kind of a labor of love for me. I'll really want to make it successful over the long haul. Building the bones correctly as a not-for-profit instead of as a DOE contractor-operated model is a different kind of thing, where it's obviously taken some time to work through some of the mechanics of that, but we're getting it done. Got great support from the department and the laboratory and Y12. So I'm sure that 10 years from now, we'll see a whole different kind of place where we can tell our stories better. And every town needs a place and places to tell their story. And AMSI, I think, is one of those places where it can be a hub for a lot of activity.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for being with us this morning and sharing your expertise and knowledge. We appreciate it.
It's always fun to talk to you and you and Ray, because you never know what you guys are going to say. So,
well, that's true. That's true. Well, thank you again. We appreciate it. Ray, who do we have scheduled next time?
Thank you, Keith. We've got Wade Cresswell. Wade presented a program to the East Tennessee Economic Council meeting on Friday, yesterday, and it was the virtual tours of the laboratory. We were just talking about the online opportunities that we have, and he will demonstrate that for us at our next Hidden History program. So we look forward to having Wade Cresswell. He's a communications at the laboratory, and will show us that virtual tours of the graphite reactor. There's even a tour of the New Bethel Baptist Church that people rarely get to see, and you can see it online now. And of course, he has tours of the new supercomputer, Frontier, that's being built now. We'll go ahead and show the supercomputers at the lab as well. So we'll have a good program with Wade next.
All right, sounds good. And that'll be, if things stay on schedule, that'll be 2 weeks from today, or December the 19th. And folks, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.